we've had several already before the summer, and we're having one now. We've got another one planned for October, and there will be more before the end of the year. So as the sign says, we are recording this one in order to pass it on to other people. So those of you who are listening but weren't able to join us, you are very welcome, even if just virtually. So the style of these pop-ups that we run, it's really informal. We're delighted to see whomever is able to be here. Chris and I will say a little bit about ourselves in a minute, but the style is that we basically talk briefly, but then we have a conversation. That's the idea, that hopefully you learn something about it from us, about the topic, but also that we use the fact that we're together to share an experience. So we are not here to talk at you for an hour and a quarter or thereabouts. It's very much meant to be around a conversation. But please, if you've got breakfast, coffee, cereal, feel free. You know, it's still relatively early here in the UK, so please feel free to munch your breakfast. We're very informal about these things. Chris, do you want to say a bit about yourself?
Absolutely not. It's a secret. No. No. So I'm Chris Nichols. I'm the co-founder of GameShift with Philippa. My background is rather a long time in strategy consulting, but before that, I used to be in the UK civil service responsible for energy policy. So I'm having a particularly painful time at the moment as I look at what's going on in the energy market, because quite a lot of the roots of the current crisis stem from the UK's version of the crisis, stem from the policy outcomes of the 1980s and early 90s, which I was heavily involved in. I left there to join Pricewaterhouse, worked all over the world, 50 odd countries, and joined Ashridge in 2000, which is where I met Philippa, and we started the participative strategy practice back in the year nod. And we've been writing and working with participative strategy ever since. And in the last few years, full-time with GameShift doing that. Philippa.
So the bit really just to add to that is that by background, I'm actually a chartered accountant. And then, as happens when you're in a large consultancy, I had the opportunity to move into consultancy and basically have stayed there ever since through various consultancies, because I love the privilege of being able to be curious about lots of different organizations. And as Chris said, we set up GameShift, working full-time with GameShift since 2016. And there are now about 20 of us working in the area of helping to shift the game of clients' organizations. But enough about all of us. The plan for today is just to remind you of what was actually on the invitation. So we want to talk a bit about where open or participative strategy comes from, and we can talk about the different wording, what it actually is in real life, where it works and where it doesn't, how to avoid faking it, which might sound a slightly odd thing, but we have seen it. And then sort of summing all of that up, we've got a number of questions that we'd offer out as being useful questions before you embark on a process of participative strategy. So that's the plan for the morning, and we will finish between 9:45 and 10 o'clock UK time. And as I say, it's very much about a conversation. So, Chris, you've thought a lot about where our work fits into the tradition of where open strategy comes from. Do you want to kick off by just saying a little bit about where it comes from?
I will, and in just a moment, I'm going to ask Rick to share a slide set. Because I'm in a travel lodge and I'm doing this on my phone, Rick is going to share the slides for me. So you may have to put up with hand waving as Rick moves the slides on. Just as we're getting the slides up, Rick, I'm just going to say to Alex, I'm delighted to see that you have Kate Rolworth's Donut Economics book sitting in the background, which is a marvelous book about economics and managing economics within planetary boundaries. But I just want to give a plug for the methodology in the book. which is based on city donuts, which are themselves forms of participative strategy. So it's about calling together, in a spirit of transition town, large public imagination sessions around how do we create a sustainable donut economic system for this city. And there's Donut Dublin, Donut Amsterdam, several Scandinavian ones, and they're all forms of participative strategy making. So it's really great to see the book, Alex. Thank you. Thank you for having it handy. So Rick, I think we can dispense with the title slide and go straight into kind of the history of participative strategy, because it has been around for a while, but strategists in business school didn't know that it had been around for a while. So when I first started getting into academic strategy about 25, 30 years ago, there were people like Michael Porter and Gary Hamel writing the big books of the time. You probably remember Competitive Strategy and Competitive Advantage by Michael Porter, and the whole work of Pralahad and Hamel on competitive advantage. And at that time, Gary Hamel once said, we know an awful lot about analytical models in strategy, but we have a dirty little secret, which is nobody actually knows how strategy gets made. We know what strategy is, but we don't know how people do it. Now, actually, this was never quite true. It's just that business school didn't have a theory about how strategy gets made. There were other people in other fields which did. Rick, if we can flick to the next slide. Back in the day, you know, many of you will have come across books that either have a ton of analytical models in them and say analysis is strategy, or using the right analytical models is strategy. Or you'll have come across books like Henry Mintzberg's Strategy Safari, which was a great survey, great safari through the field of different ways of looking at strategy, but they were mostly concerned with the question of what strategy is rather than where strategy comes from. And participative strategy was part of a shift to be more interested in how do you get strategy than what's the content of strategy. So I hope that difference kind of means something. And the point is, when we talk about participative strategy, which essentially is just opening the doors to wider systemic ways of engaging with strategy, all of the analytical toolkit and all of the creative toolkit still matters. It's just used in a different way, and it concerns who gets involved in strategy and how do you involve people in it. So next one, Rick. Now, when I said participative strategy was always happening, it was, but all the writing about it and all the development of practice came from fields other than business school strategic thinkers. So if you were to look in terms of system thinking or group dynamics or large group process work, there was always, from the 1970s and 80s onwards, a ton of work going on in terms of how do you engage wider and wider parts of the system in conversations about the organizational future. So on here, you have people like Ralph Stacey and Patricia Shaw and Doug Griffin. In the top right of the picture, you have Bill Critchley from Ashridge Consulting in the bottom right. You have Bob Marshak, the originator of Dialogic OD, along with Gervais Bush in the top left. And you have Sandra Janoff and Marv Weisbord, bottom left, who created the whole future search, get the system in the room practice. All of these are different ways of creating large participative organizational systemic conversations. The thing is, they never taught or wrote in a way that mainstream strategist accessed. And still to this day, these two fields coexist. They're completely separate. I mean, someone like Bill Critchley or Ralph Stacey or Patricia Shaw would largely dismiss, and have dismissed many times, academic strategy and business school strategy as an irrelevant sideline. And business school strategists have largely not read the work of Weisbord or Griffin or Shaw or Marshak. They're different worlds.
Chris, I'm just conscious that you said OD. That might not be familiar to some people.
Tell us what it means, Philippa.
It means organisation development. So, Chris, do you want to just explain it a bit more? Because you will do it much better than I will.
Yeah, I'm guessing that quite a lot of people on the call have heard of OD, but essentially what it means is it's a positive view that organisations can do work on themselves for collective improvement. So it comes out of the positive humanistic psychology of the 1970s, and it is unashamedly biased work in favour of more human, more participative organisations. This was really niche work in terms of mainstream business in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, but is pretty much central now. Almost every business school has programs that are based on OD practices and principles, but they often don't refer to the literature at all. Next one, Rick. These are the book covers of just a couple of the books. If you're going to look into the field at all from an OD perspective, it's not essential to this call, and neither of these books would mention the word strategy as far as I'm aware. But these are a couple of examples. The one on the right is Weisbord and Janoff. Philippa and I we've taken part in many future search conferences over the years. Our own work has some roots in common, but differs wildly from future search. And we have a lot in common with Marshak and Bush dialogic OD, which is much closer to Patricia Shaw and Ralph Stacey's conversational dynamics of organizations. Next slide. Now, this is where it gets more interesting, because although I said the fields had been largely separate, they started to come together about 20 years ago. And they came together largely, or at least it always involved the work of the guy on the right, who's Richard Whittington. Richard used to be at Templeton in Oxford. These days he's at Said Business School. And 20, 25 years ago, he started getting interested in a real sideline field, which was called strategy as practice. And this is people who collectively researched Hamel's dirty little secret that nobody knew where strategy came from. Actually, there was always a group of people in academia who were interested in where does strategy come from. And Whittington, over time, made it his major area of study, culminating in this book, Opening Strategy, which is a good few years ago now. And that was an academic tracing of how strategy went from being a tiny, elite, niche analytical process to being various forms of wider, open, more participative strategy making. And Philippa, actually, Richard called us up donkeys years ago because he'd heard a rumor that we were doing something.
Yes, it was quite funny. We actually got a call from, oh my goodness, it's Richard Whittington. He wants to speak to us, and went over to Oxford, and he said, well, I've been writing about this for years, but I understand you guys are actually doing this in practice. And we had some really interesting conversations that followed from that.
Yeah, at that point, hardly anybody was doing it in practice. It was very niche. Right, I think we've got one more slide, Rick, haven't we? Yeah, so just in the last couple of years, we've started to see some mainstream business books that absolutely bring what they call open strategy, what we call participative strategy, right to the center of things. And I do recommend them, actually. I could quibble with the methodology of both, but I think they're both brilliant. So on the left, you've got Gary Hamel. He of the Dirty Little Secret actually now believes he's discovered the secret, which is involving human beings. He wrote this book, Humanocracy, which is about how you can get more value out of organizations and more creativity the more you open it up. No surprise there. Much more rigorously, Christian Stadler has written Open Strategy. Now, this book has featured at Davos, it's featured at the World Economic Forum, it's featured at the United Nations. It's actually done more than any other book to bring the practice and toolkit of open strategy right to the center of, for example, McKinsey's reading list. And it's terrific to see it. So we'll say a little bit more about Stadler and open strategy, perhaps when we get to the conversation, because I recommend the book, and we have some gloss that we'd like to add to it. Finally, we should mention our own writing. Philippa and I have been writing about this for a long time. In the Chief Strategy Officer Playbook, which was launched at Davos about 4 years ago, maybe, we wrote about a large strategy process we ran with Saint-Gobain, which some of you may know is a global material sciences company. In Joe Whitehead's book, we wrote a really practical chapter. Joe asked us, Joe's a traditional strategy author, and he wanted a chapter on participation and how to engage people. So we wrote a chapter in that book on what we call strategic engagement. And then on the right is our own book, which covers the absolute do's, don'ts toolkit. So pretty much everything we're talking about on this call, you will find in the book on the right, in much more detail, but it's still a very small and simple book. It's 20-odd thousand words. It's more like a big pamphlet than a book. Right, I think that's enough of our slides, because I think the main thing is we've now described the background, we've described the territory, looked at the roots. I think it's much more interesting probably for everybody if we look at what you actually do and what it means. And the expert on that is Philippa.
Well, thank you. I think you're just as much an expert as I am. But what we thought might be helpful is actually just to, as Chris said, if those are the roots, what is participative or open strategy actually in practice? And I mean, it is very straightforward. Basically, it's where you invite a number of people into a process to think about the future of an organization, but they're the people who would not normally be invited in, whether it's tens of them or hundreds of them or potentially even thousands. But what we would say is that it's more than the usual suspects. It's not just the senior team. It's not just a group of consultants working on it. And the reason that if you're interested in a participative strategy process, you invite people in because you invite them to bring their ideas, their insights, to challenge assumptions that you might already be thinking about, to basically help widen the thinking of the senior team. And obviously that does mean that the person or the people who are doing the inviting have to be up for actually hearing those ideas and insights. And that doesn't always happen. And when Chris and I were talking about today, we were reminded of a CEO of who shall remain nameless, of a hospitality company, who, when we were invited to speak to him about doing some participative strategy, I'm not quite sure why he took the meeting, actually, because he said, well, why would I want to hear their ideas? I pay them to run restaurants, but I know which restaurants to buy. He was really clear. I don't want to invite people in. And the good thing is that he didn't invite people in, because one of the worst things you can do is invite people in to talk, but not actually be interested in what they're going to say. In most participative strategy processes, you're inviting people to contribute their ideas, but not to take part in the decision making. And that's something you always have to be clear about, because actually the world is not a democracy. Organizations are not a democracy. It's really important, however, that you're clear that I might be inviting your ideas, which may or may not be taken forward to the next step. I think one of the other features of participative or open strategy process is that it can take a bit longer, simply because of the logistics of involving more people. But in everybody who we have spoken to who's interested in it or has done it, they have always felt that the time payoff has been beneficial. It doesn't need to take much longer, but it typically will take a bit longer. And I guess the thing is that you need to make sure you may need to recognize you might hear things you either didn't know if you're the most senior person or the senior team, or equally you weren't actually sure you wanted to hear, and that's quite an important part of it. But having just very briefly described it, that all sounds a bit dry, and actually the work isn't dry at all. It's really creative, really interesting and fulfilling work. So unless anybody's got any specific questions about the process, we thought we might talk about a few client stories to kind of bring it to life. So we'll assume, unless anybody waves their hand, that we'll talk about some client stories. So Chris, I think the first one I want to talk about is an engineering company, a well-known engineering company, and there was one particular division that was basically the cash cow of this engineering firm, an international firm. And the MD of this particular function, which was the largest one, he thought that the management team wasn't making well enough informed decisions. So that's where it came from. They had gone through lots of strategy processes to think about what they as a division needed to be doing, particularly being the biggest in the organization. But it came from a point of him saying, we, the management team, are not making decisions that are informed widely enough and well enough about what's really going on. So he invited people, or the management people invited people to talk about different areas of the business, which included commercial aspects, people aspects, operational. There was even one group that was, what are the things we should be thinking about that aren't even on our radar at all? The management team itself set some, if you like, guardrails. They did some preliminary thinking about key success factors and what they thought were the things that they as a division needed to be really good at. And they gave that to all the work streams that were then set up. So there were some clear sort of parameters in which the management team was asking the work streams to play. And there were about six to eight teams, each of about 10 to 12 people. And when the management team were thinking about who to invite, one of the things that was most interesting and that caused them to think the longest was when we asked the question, so who are not the usual suspects? Who are the people you would actually really rather not involve because they're a hassle, but actually you probably ought to involve because they're a hassle and they're likely to ask the questions that you might not want to hear, or they might bring ideas that you might want to hear. And it led to a really interesting conversation in the management team. And I remember them talking about a particular person saying, oh, he's such a pain in the neck. They actually said something else, but let's say pain in the neck. He's such a pain in the neck. And then there was a sort of pause and but I think we really need to hear from him. We really need to know what he's thinking, because he does shake up our thinking. So although we find him a pain, because he shakes up our thinking, that's precisely why he should be involved. So what actually happened was that these work streams met 2 or 3 times over a period of a few weeks to answer a series of questions in their particular theme that they were exploring. And then a subset of each of those teams met with the management team. I think they met twice actually over the period of the whole process for a day. And basically the point of that was to share the work that each work stream had been doing. And each work stream was sponsored by somebody from the management team, but they weren't leading it. But for each work stream to share the ideas they'd come up with, the questions they had. And through the day, they then started to understand where there were overlaps between the different work streams, where there were gaps potentially in their collective thinking, where they realized more questions were coming up. And over that iterative process, they came up with a series of recommendations, which the management team then, the MD was really clear. He said, we, the management team, are now going to take this away and we're going to make decisions about what we're actually going to do, bearing in mind all these different ideas and assumption challenging that had gone on. So they were a division of about 1,000 people, and approximately 100 people were involved. And bearing in mind that each of them, as part of the whole process, were talking to a couple of people, they were asked to speak to a couple of their closest colleagues. So one way or another, about a third of the division were actually involved in the process. I think it probably took about 4 months or so. And the MD was maybe 4 to 6 months, I would say. But the MD was absolutely convinced that the management team, made better decisions regarding the division's future as a result. Chris, is there anything you think I might have missed out that would be useful for me to say?
Not on that one, but can I just use the opportunity to make a link to Christian Stadler's book, Open Strategy, because one of the differences between his work and ours is around decision making. And Stadler's book has a whole chapter on participative decision making and how you can actually get the whole organization to make a decision rather than the chief exec or the board or the exec committee. There are both methods for doing it, particularly using virtual technologies and polling and that kind of thing. And there is quite a strong academic body of research on the quality of crowdsourced decisions actually being very robust. We have just never seen a process in which crowdsourced decisions have taken precedence over the executive, because the executive generally has a legal responsibility, and you'd be a pretty brave executive, given your legal responsibilities, to say, well, we disagree with this decision, but the crowd has made it. We've never actually seen that in practice, but Christian Stadler's book does argue for it. Philippa, why don't we talk about a large university? Would that be a good way to go?
Yes, I think we will. So a large university, we can name it because they have talked about us, and we have worked with them over a number of years, which is Nottingham Trent University. So ex-Trent Poly, which became one of the newer universities. And we've worked with them twice now over their strategy process, which started in about 2014 or thereabouts, when the new Vice Chancellor came in and was convinced, because of his own research in the past, was convinced that the best way to develop strategy was in a more participative way. So we were involved the first time around in a process to have a number of large group conversations. And then about 3-4 years later, the Vice Chancellor wanted to start thinking again about the strategy, looking forward to the next 5 years. And he wanted even more people involved, because he said, actually, I want us to get more radical, to think wider, to challenge ourselves more, because we know that it was successful, because we as an organization have really improved up the rankings, etc., and through the league tables over the last few years. But I want us to challenge ourselves more. I don't want us to rest on our laurels. And so then started a process whereby, we laid out a continuum of things that you could do, from challenging yourselves a bit to really challenging yourselves. And they went kind of more towards the more challenging yourselves end of things, because actually, as well as involving staff, they also involved about 5,000 alumni, because they involved them virtually by asking them questionnaires, saying what else did they want from the university, looking forwards, because one of the things they wanted to think about was lifelong learning, being a partner as a university, not only when you're a student here, but as you become an alumnus and you move forwards through your life, how can we be a lifelong partner in that learning of yours? So the alumni were involved, the students were very involved, and in fact, they had their own strand of work, which was about, so what do you need from the university and what are you prepared to contribute to the university? And actually the head of the student union, the president of the student union, was actually invited to Board of Governors meetings. He was invited to large events that the staff had to make sure that the student voice was front and center in terms of the work that was being done. Civic society was also involved. There was a very strong, Nottingham Trent has a very strong sense of location in the city, and also in terms of its wish to enable social mobility to happen. So actually, as part of this work, the university reached out to colleges in more deprived parts of the city and said, actually, in our future, how can we as a university be contributing to the learning and bringing learning to the people whom you're serving, who would potentially never think about going to university or might never have that expectation. So to start developing those partnerships. And they also looked at universities abroad to see what they could learn from them in terms of working face-to-face, in terms of working remotely. This was obviously before COVID, and they've moved even further in that direction since then. So how they actually did it was the university executive team, so the most senior team of the university, they actually identified 5 different themes that they wanted explored. So for example, I've already mentioned one of them, lifelong learning, being a partner in lifelong learning. They wanted to look at things like, what is our place in society, both locally and globally? So big questions that they were asking themselves. And what they actually called them was lenses. They said these are different lenses through which we want to think about us as a university and how they move forward, how we move forward rather into the future, and how do we really take our place. And I think one of the proudest moments for the Vice-Chancellor was that at one point, an invitation was sent out to all staff to come and participate in a conference. And this was a face-to-face conference. And they had 150 spaces, and 300 people said they wanted to come out of all the staff. And so they had a bit of a dilemma about what they did. Gosh, do we disappoint as many people as we reject as many people as we take on? Do we run it twice, or gulp? Do we hold something for 300 people? They decided that they did have a space that was large enough for 300 people. So actually, we had a very large group event, this conference, whereby people were asked to come and participate in all sorts of different conversations, taking on board some of the data that had come from earlier. And the Vice-Chancellor's proudest moment around that was that 2 of the people who participated in the conference were cleaners. They were cleaners, and they had said they wanted to participate, and would it be all right to them? Now, it was quite sad they had to ask that question because the invitation had been sent to all staff, but he was absolutely thrilled that they felt that they were able to have a voice in the future of the university. And actually, in terms of, is the proof in the pudding? They went on in 2019 to become University of the Year. And actually, even now, they are continuing to build on the participative way that they think about their future. Chris, is there anything you want to add to that?
I'd like to just reflect what one thing that they noticed, which is when they started, when Edward Peck first joined, they very much had a sense of themselves as being a modern university that was serving a local market, a local community. By the time they'd gone through 2 rounds of this, they were seeing themselves as one of the world's leading modern universities, and the Russell Group universities were coming to visit them to find out how they did it. That was a huge turnaround because they were very bold in how they engaged people and got new ideas, and it just showed in the results. Philippa, I would like us to open this up to a conversation, but I would also like to say one thing about the Cochrane collaboration, which is one of our earliest pieces of work, just because it was so radical at the time, and it kind of, it's useful today. So just in a nutshell, Cochrane is a global medical charity that's hugely virtual. So they, when we first started working with them, which is about 15, 16 years ago, they had a staff of about 8, but 15,000 collaborators. So it's just astonishingly light in the center. And yet the centre had to create a strategy process, which by its constitution as a collaboration had to engage all the collaborators. And they had no budget. So when they came to us, this was in our Ashridge days, they said, can you please price up what it would take for Ashridge Consulting, as it then was, to engage this great mass of people? And we gave them a number and they said, that's very interesting because we have just under 10% of that budget available. And this was a great challenge to have. And it caused Philippa and I to invent a process that they could use that essentially meant them doing the engagement entirely for themselves, using their existing meetings and infrastructure, their existing technology. They created nothing new. They just put strategic questions into every meeting they were going to have, and then had a few summit gatherings, which Philippa and I facilitated or helped them to facilitate. And through that process, they engaged several thousand people over a 6-month period on a minimal budget. And by their own definition, they said that it was the most successful strategy process they'd ever run, because the board not only agreed with it, but signed it off spontaneously and unanimously because they'd been involved all the way through, which was a good result for them. And Cochrane grew as a result of that work. Full credit to them. They grew to a much bigger organization over the coming years.
Philippa, and I think I was just going to say, I think one of the challenges with Cochrane was that these collaborators that Chris talked about, they're people in universities, in policy areas, in government, in public health, who basically are permitted by their employing organizations to spend a day a week or 3 days a month or whatever it might be, contributing to the Cochrane collaboration for the greater good. But it does mean as a result that it really was, the strings between the centre of Cochrane and its collaboration, the collaborators rather, was very, there was no employment link between them. It was about inviting that goodwill in. And I think it is really, I think the thing for me that it was really helpful about it is it showed that the process could just be part of a normal process. It doesn't need to be something, a couple of people need to think about it specifically, but you can just add it on to existing meetings, as Chris said. But also the nature of the invitation meant that people really did want to participate in it again. And without that, without so many people participating, and I think at the end of the day, they calculated that out of the 15,000, over 3,000 had in one way contributed something. They absolutely would not have got the strategy passed because the board had a history of being extremely challenging before approving anything because of the slightly odd nature of the organization and its politics as a result. So I think it does really show that because they managed to involve so many people, that was absolutely, they were really clear that that was the reason why the board put it through essentially on the nod.
Yeah. Just to give you an example of that, it's such a radically decentralized medical organization that the chief executive, who's not a doctor, was not actually allowed to go to the conference of the organization, the annual conference, because it was only medics. So to get the strategy conversation going at that large medical conference, we helped them to design a trade booth at the trade fair that goes along with the conference. So there was a strategy booth, which was come along and talk about the strategy of Cochrane at a stall in the trade fair with loads of different ways of having conversations. And we helped them dream up how to do it, but they ran it all for themselves and it worked.
But we must say, actually, as part of helping them dream it up, we actually did a process with them where we said, what is the worst thing that could happen if you were, where this sort of exhibition stand, this trade booth could be at this medical symposium? And we got them to think about what could be the worst and then, in a creative way to turn it around. And what they actually said was the worst thing was if we were positioned outside the loos. That would just be terrible, if that's where it was. And they called us on the first day of the symposium and said, you'll never guess where we've been put. We're outside the ladies' loos. And actually, as it turned out, outside the ladies' loos was a terrific place to be because people were queuing up. And so actually they later on subscribed it to the fact that they'd had so many people come visit was because they were outside the loos and there was a queue.
Participative strategy as the coup for the loo. Philippa, we should open this up to people.
Yeah, I think, is this something you've experienced yourself or toyed with or thought about doing, or, good, bad or indifferent? It's, we'd really like to hear from you about, have you ever heard of this before? Have you
done it? Yeah.
I'll make a comment if that's okay. So
I'm
Alex, everybody. I should say I'm a partner with GameShift, but I'm not particularly involved in strategy work, so this isn't my area of expertise. Although, having just heard your lovely descriptions of work, I realise I have been doing it for a long time, and it reminded me of in an older life I did a lot of work as an environmental management consultant around environmental management systems. And in fact, the way that we did it was open strategy. I hadn't realised until you just told me that. So because we were looking at issues like energy and waste and climate, but we insisted on bringing everybody into the room. And so the cleaners, they knew a lot about waste management, for example. And we always just thought it was a natural thing to do, to tell the senior management team, senior leaders, to invite everybody into the room over a series of meetings to get their opinions and ideas about how to reduce the environmental footprint of the organisation. So thank you for that. So I've realised I've been doing it for a long time and I hadn't realised that. And it's so sensible. And how else would you do it? I mean, why would you not involve those people? So thank you.
Yeah.
And actually, just one thing I think around that, why would you not do it? I think from experience, I would say, if you're not going to do it authentically, you're not really interested in hearing people's opinions or views, then actually don't do it. Because the worst thing I think you could do is pretend that you're doing it, but actually because you'll spend time and effort, and actually you were going to do it and take your own decisions anyway. And I think one of the things that CEOs or MDs sometimes worry about is that by opening it up, they will lose control. And I think the thing that we would always say is, no, because you need to be really clear about the invitation you are making to people. You're not saying, come along and be part of this expanded executive team, and you're going to be, you're all going to have a vote and we're going to do exactly what you say. If that's your invitation, then quite frankly, you kind of deserve what you get. But it's really important to actually have the guardrails around and be really clear about what your invitation is. So I think sometimes CEOs are anxious about it because they do have a sense of losing control. But actually, I would say it's about lessening control in terms of getting ideas and insights, but you still, the CEO, have the control, because ultimately you will, in all probability, be making the decision. Sorry, Chris, were you going to add something?
No, I was enthusiastically agreeing, I think.
Alice, you were saying something.
Oh, can I just say, Alice, and also I noticed there was a comment from Jenny.
From
so
Jenny,
Alice,
yes.
Alice first, and then see if Jenny has something.
And then Lena, I see you've got your hand up. Alice.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philippa. Chris, I think I was about to say we do this every day in our line of business. We run very large international health research projects, and it's standard practice in a lot of health research. Unless you involve your patient, your caregivers, the family of the patient in trying to improve the life of the patient, you've got to involve that whole chain. Otherwise, you're not going to make any difference. So at that level, hearing your examples and listening to you talk, yes, absolutely. You've got to involve everybody that's got any kind of a purchase point on the particular issue at hand. Doing it to the organisation itself, no, we've never done it that way. But I think we've probably got the skills to do it, given that we do it day to day anyway. So yeah, quite an interesting thought process for me there. Thank you both.
I think that's actually interesting when you say we've got the skills to do it, but we don't think about doing it to ourselves as an organisation. I have a sense that perhaps more people would do it if more organisations would use it, if they knew about it, and perhaps if they you know, there was a slight sense of, oh, this sounds big and difficult and expensive and time consuming. And actually, as with the Cochrane example, it absolutely doesn't need to be any of those. But I think all the people we've worked with or researched about, they've all said that it has absolutely been worth the additional time investment in terms of the quality of the conversations and the decisions that they've been able to make as a result.
Yeah. Well, above all, you know, I mean, if I think back deep into the mists of time, my phone used to ring more often than not because people said, "Oh, we have a brilliant strategy, but we can't get buy-in." I said, well, yes, that's because you're trying to sell it to people. You know, if people build it with you, you don't need to get buy-in. You've got buy-in. They built it, and the fact that it takes a little bit of time to set up more than pays for itself, and you don't have to spend all your time ramming a pre-packaged strategy down people's throats trying to get buy-in. You know, and the one thing I've experienced over all the years is CEOs going, I'm genuinely amazed by the engagement we've got. It's been astonishingly positive. I didn't think people would give up their time to join in, and universally, enough people will. Not everybody will, but there'll be enough energy to make it work, and you work with the energy that's there. Now, I think Lena and Jenny were trying to.
Yeah, so Jenny, I know you put in the chat about really like to hear from your 4,500. So we'd love to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, sure, Philippa. We used it as methodology for managing the Barclays ABSA separation program, which was Barclays separating from its African assets, to run it over about a 12-month period. And it was roughly 4,500 people across 12 markets. And then we also had a large external stakeholder community that also actively participated up to certain stages, you know, more in the initial exploratory pieces. But in total, I'd say probably if you take those exploratory aspects into consideration, it was probably closer to about 10,000 across 12 markets.
Yeah.
Really impressive.
But it was really yeah, I mean, the scale was phenomenal. The complexity, because of it being in a highly regulated sector, was it hadn't been done before.
Yeah.
I like your example of including the cleaners in the organization structure. The entry point was tellers, bank tellers, and we had a peer nominated process. So there was broad-based participation in the exploratory process, but then as we got deeper and deeper into the strategy formulation process, we used a peer nomination-based nomination process, and we whittled, 45,000 people down to 500, but they were peer-based nominations from across the whole organization structure, who then attended the actual I think you used the word conferences, so we had something similar like that as well. So that was also a really interesting application where people were nominated by their peers, their managers, their subordinates to participate, and so that also created quite an interesting engagement process for buy-in. On your point around not having an example where the crowdsourced decisions overrode executive, there were some decisions that in that process, particularly around, perhaps not strict operational director responsibility decisions, but things like culture design, things like operating models. Those were heavily influenced from the bottom up instead of top down. So it was a very interesting one of a kind.
Brilliant. Jenny, do you know, has that case been written up as a story at any point? Because it does sound really powerful story.
Yeah, Chris, not from a participative strategy point of view. It's I'm actually busy writing the case study with Professor Mary Bean from Texas, from a leadership perspective, but we haven't done it from a participative strategy, no.
Right. Fantastic. What a great story.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested, Jenny, what particularly because it was happening in such regulated industry or sector, I'm really interested as to what was the trigger point. Was it an external person saying, why don't you think about it this way, you know, to the CEO or whomever, or because that's actually quite an you know, given that it's so regulated, it just feels like it must have had quite a big trigger to basically, you know, be able to meet all the regulatory demands, etc.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think there were a couple of trigger points. I don't think it was one specific event. I think if you think of the dynamics of a multinational organization like a banking group, where you have, like you say, that traditional sort of very heavy top-down process, the African business and the European business were literally two completely different worlds, yet the African business was heavily dominated by the European perspective on things. And I think one of the triggers was a sense of restoring autonomy and restoring self-determination, which was a really key cultural and leadership dynamic change. But I think there was also, combined with that, why it ended up being more participatory than perhaps what was initially just would have been thought about, was a decision within the executive, driven by the CEO at the time, to say that in line with that sort of sense of reestablishing autonomy and self-determination, was to counterintuitively get rid of all the consultants. So a lot of the consultants were then used as capacity builders rather than necessarily process drivers. And so it was something that was heavily defined and owned internally. Certainly on the corporate strategy side, still a lot of guidance through that journey from the traditional management consultants. But in the broader, what was called the brand and name change process, equally heavily regulated because of what it impacted, the consultants were purely a capacity building process and drove that completely internally.
Right. Wow.
And in fact, actually, I would say at NTU, our role was also in terms of capacity building. So we helped design the process, but we were only involved to the extent with some of the university executive team conversations, the very large conferences, summits. Because of that was just they didn't have the experience of running those, but actually all the focus groups and all the student stuff, all the alumni stuff, that was all done internally, and we were involved essentially as a resource and as a kind of making sure that everybody was bringing together all the information and all the insights.
Yeah, I think over the years. Oh, sorry, Jenny, crack on.
I just in response to what Philippa was saying, interestingly enough, on the brand change side, that was a process we designed internally, and then found consultants to capacitate in the areas that was needed. So it was just I suppose it's because we had a strong internal strategy team at the time, but it was actually internally driven, which was again quite an anomaly.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, Chris.
I think Lena was trying to speak earlier. Yeah. Hello, Lena.
Trying to speak. Yes. Hi. I work as an organizational development consultant in Denmark. So I've done these similar works many times on a much smaller scale. But I would be interested in talking to you or having your views on the division between the strategy making and the implementation, because I find that when people are invited into these conversations on strategy, they go and do the work by themselves afterwards. So the implementation is superfluous. So you get management teams talking about, now we have the strategy. Yes, and now we go and do the implementation, and everyone is ahead of them, you know. So can you talk a little bit about how you work with that, and can you I don't know. Yes.
No, it's a brilliant question, Lena. And actually, as you were describing it, the difference between, now we've got the strategy, now we need to implement it. Just into my head cropped this image from when I was a junior consultant in a big consultancy, which will remain nameless. And we'd done a big strategy process, a very clever analytical strategy process, and come up with a document, and it all looked beautiful. And we went to the Netherlands to present it. And it was, it was really well done. And it absolutely hit mark. The client was delighted. And in the lift on the way down, I remember the partner saying, well, that went really well. I wonder if we'll get the implementation work. And for me, that was just such a like, well, we've created this thing that is absolutely terrific, super, absolutely no link. Well, there was no link in several ways. One, it was done purely by consultants. But secondly, there was this absolute separation between the strategy document, which was called the strategy, and the implementation. And what we would always say is that actually we would talk much more about a process of strategizing, and we would argue that that actually by this process of involving more people in the participative process, you are inevitably starting the process of implementing the strategy, because as you said, Lena, people will go off and do things of their own accord because suddenly a conversation has prompted something. Oh, actually, when I was at that focus group with these people from a different part of the organization, I had that really interesting conversation with X when they were saying they do this very similar process to us in that way. Oh, maybe I should just try doing it that way. And actually you find that it starts to have legs even before it's formally been signed off, because people just do stuff. And therefore we would always say actually that one of the reasons for doing it is that your chances of making the implementing and having a sustainable strategy, and I mean sustainable as in embedded, fundamental, will actually work and last, is much greater if you have a more participative process in the ideas creation and the exploring stage. Graham.
Thank you. I wanted to build on that, and thanks for everything so far. It's really prompting lots of thoughts. It's captured in Lena's question around this distinction between strategy making and its implementation, and I kind of and back, Chris, to your initial framing of this in terms of people knew what strategy was but didn't know how it was formed. I kind of wonder what your sense is of strategy itself in this, because it feels as if in a lot of the descriptions so far we're still holding on to an idea of a strategy, and it being a singular thing, and it being something that's kind of formed or created in a complex system. And so you've got lots of writers in, you've got the Ralph Stacey's and Patricia Shaw's and so on, Mary Olbein we've heard mentioned as well, and I think they'd have an argument that says that's all a bit of nonsense, really, that that isn't how their sense of the world works. And some of the framing of how you describe participative strategy feels as it's still quite rooted in a kind of a particular view of what strategy is. I think your engineering company was a good example of that in a way. So felt like the power still, it still felt very parental. It felt very sort of kind of power focused. And that's not intended as a criticism of your work in any way, more the environment in which we're all trying to work, and some of the more fundamental shifts that we're trying to make in the way in which people see the world. So I kind of wonder what your sense is in your experience of that, of questions of, well, what really is strategy? the work you're doing, how that is shifting your power relationships. How is it, to Lena's question, truly releasing more agency and liberation within organizations and so on. So I think pick the bones out of that as a question, as it were, and see where you or others want to go with that.
Right, my word. Now this is doctoral level stuff. I'm delighted to yeah. Okay, so the short answer is, pragmatically, we don't adopt a doctrinaire position on strategy. So we work with the client's definition of strategy rather than our own definition, and just help them to do the job as well as possible. So we describe ourselves as a client's thinking partner. So if they have a traditional organizational view of strategy, we will help them to work with that as well as it can be worked with. Now, unfortunately, our friend Olga Gazarian was going to be on this call, but has got stuck on a train. And Olga is strategy director of WaterAid, and they've just completed a global strategy process, which is going to be discussed on our next pop-up. Olga and William are going to come along and talk about a very different kind of strategy in a non-profit global organization, trying to do strategy with an explicit, how do we get beyond the colonial non-government organization view of strategy, global organization, global, working in all kinds of places, but with the strategy driven from a head office in London. And they tried to get away from that. So that's the next pop-up. I suppose my honest answer is we probably have worked helping to liberalize and loosen up traditional views of strategy more than we've worked with genuinely dialogic, complex views of strategy, mainly because the people who work in a genuinely dialogical way probably don't regard what they're doing as a strategy process at all. Yeah, so almost by definition, you wouldn't get hired to do the work in that more, if you were thinking about the Patricia Shaw, Bill Isaacs way of working, there wouldn't be a job to do in some ways. The other thing I would say is, and where we do get a little bit rigid about our own model, is we hold quite closely to a Stacey inspired view of there actually is no difference between strategizing or strategy intention and implementation. Unless you're doing both at the same time, you're not doing it at all. So if you just come up with a better strategic intention and don't involve people in actually doing the work, you've got a really dumb strategy. Yeah, because actually the strategy won't ever get beyond some kind of artifact if that's all you do. So we're really interested in how do you create the conditions for people to live the strategy as a communicative process, as a meaning-making process, beyond just creating a statement of intent. And that is something we hold to quite closely. But we're very often frustrated that the grand intentions of a participative process don't always carry forward. And we've seen it absolutely not carried forward, and we've seen it really very well carried forward. And a lot of that comes down to the degree to which the most senior people get it. And I think the radical Stacey Shaw model only works, ironically, if enough senior people get it sufficient that they don't get in the way of it. Yeah, it's a real act of leadership to create the conditions where that's possible.
And I think that comes back to this point about the control that it can be, that it could, because again, you have to let go control. And I think also the other thing is sometimes CEOs or exec teams, they like the idea of the strategy and getting to the artifact, the vision, the intent, because it's wordsmithed words, and actually the implementation, there is quite often a sense of, it's messier. And I think the messiness between the two, or the perceived messiness, it isn't actually messy, but I think it requires probably quite a sophisticated way of looking at, as leadership, as Chris said.
I just thought it was an absolutely spot on question, and we could run a whole other pop-up just on that. I've only got 5 minutes, Philippa, before.
Oh, hang on a second. Nick's just written something.
Okay.
I think there's something.
I can't. Just so you know, I can't see the chat.
There is something. Okay, so Nick's written. I think there is something here about labeling. In my experience, a lot of strategy is delivered without the strategy label. Can you say a bit more, Nick?
Yeah, I think in the big picture, if you look at Cooper Rider in Cleveland, Ohio, their appreciative inquiry work surely was open participative strategy. And then bring it right down to the local level. I imagine a scrapyard. Well, I was working with a company that had grown up from a scrapyard, uber conservative. And the whole team came to learn about organizational self-management. And they drew pictures, all of them drew pictures. And they went back to the principal site for the organization. And those pictures were certainly there for 2 years, are probably still there now. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, I just saw in the local paper that they had 9 sites. The most stuck site had just evolved into where everybody else wanted it to go. And that was all done on an organizational self-management label, but was absolutely what we're talking about here this morning. So I think your question, what is strategy and what is the label? I think it's kind of much softer than that now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, which is why when we go right back to the things at the start, I think the formal academic discipline of strategy largely involves putting things in a box. You can write books about strategy. Actually has is only just catching up with practice that good inclusive organizations have been doing for years. And often the label doesn't help. Philippa, I've only got a minute or two, because actually, ironically, the reason I'm in a travel lodge here is
such is the glamour of consulting life.
Such is the glamour of consulting life. I'm actually working with an organization that isn't very far away from where I am, and I'm about to go to a participative group that's helping to do some strategic. It's a major strategic shift in the food sector, and they have an aspiration of grassroots involvement, and they're doing it very well. But they come from a tradition, rather like you were saying, Nick, of involving co-owners in a lot of decisions. It's part of their core way of being. Philippa, it might be you can either crack on without me, or we can move to the questions. It's kind of.
Well, I just wanted to check just before, because I know you've got a few minutes still. Graham, did you had a finger up? Was that because you were just pointing your finger, or was it a sort of hand up sort of thing? I wasn't quite sure.
I'm sure I had a question, but I mean, I think I was going to agree. I was going to agree with Nick, really. And I guess that's the problem with any label. I mean, that's we then get into even more philosophical question around language and its role in all of this, and so on. But I'll resist the temptation to go there. The only comment I'd put on the back of all of this, I think, certainly as someone, and I guess some of us are in this position where or even when we're in organizations and we're wrestling with these issues, is the degree to which we go with the prevailing worldview and the degree to which we try to swim against it. And I had the pleasure of meeting Patricia Shaw probably 15 plus years ago. And I was, I loved her. I just read her Changing Conversations book, and I loved it, and was all enthusiastic. And my lasting memory of that was her question to me, which is, okay, then, well, why do you keep colluding with these organizations then? And I never managed to quite shake that off. And I'm sure I continue to collude with dominant views in organizations, from a position, as you describe, sort of meeting clients where they are and all of that good stuff. But I think there's an interesting tension for us working in this space, is the degree to which we go with or go against, whether we zig or zag with some of these ideas.
Totally. And of course, collusion is quite a loaded framing too. It's not a neutral framing in itself, and we are all stuck within the framings, and I think we all, anybody who's doing OD work, has to just make a live discernment about, is this valuable work done well, or is this really quite crap work that I'm doing just to pay the bills? And I think we have to continually ask ourselves that question, whether you're in an organization or not, I think. Yeah. Chris, do you want to talk about the questions? Because I think we said we'd have 5 questions to think about, but actually I think we've got a bonus question as well. Yeah, we lied. Rick, did you have them on a slide? Yeah. So I think, I think the starting point is just to be really clear what you're trying to do by having an open strategy process, because I think people can use it as a panacea. I think it's really helpful to, especially now that all these books have come out and people are going, oh yeah, we want some of that. It's really useful to talk about why. What are you actually trying to do? Next one, Rick. So in terms of your givens and your must-haves and your non-negotiables, we talked about the fear that sometimes CEOs seem to have, or MDs or whomever, around it before embarking on this, about it might be a free-for-all. But actually, if you are clear about there are certain things that are non-negotiable, we've made a decision about that, and obviously it brings into question about power and this kind of thing. But actually, therefore, that gives a clarity and a boundary to the work that's being done and to the invitation that you're giving to people. I think the more you want a creative open process, the more clear you have to be on constraints, must-haves, givens, boundaries, and containment. Next one, Rick. Yeah, well, Philippa, you said this one earlier, and I think it's really important. Don't do this at all unless you are actually interested in having your assumptions challenged. It's really bad if all you do is go, oh, that's interesting, but no. And I think the other thing is that we have seen at least discussions about, oh, well, we could ask people, but actually we know what we know what we will hear from them. And if that's your assumption that we know what we will hear from them, then probably that might suggest that you're not really open enough to hearing things. That point about I employ people to run restaurants, I'll decide which restaurants we buy. Why would I want to ask them? I think it's a good example to keep in your mind. Yeah, as one chief executive who was an entrepreneur owner said to us, it's my effing train set. If that's your view, you probably don't want to open your process at all. Yeah. Next question. And that's what that one means, unless you're prepared and this comes back to Graham's point about the whole relationship between strategy and power and strategy and identity. And indeed, the identity as one chief exec said to us, strategy, that's my job. Well, if that's your definition of how you use your power and your identity, actually, there's a whole problem with strategy if you make it your job and your identity as being the chief strategist. So one of the things at the more frontier edge of this work that's necessary to do is to problematize the whole concept of strategy and how it gets attached to power. And I would say, actually, if I think about NTU, one of the things was that by opening it up, the process so widely, actually, in many respects, I think the VC, the Vice Chancellor, almost increased his power
not in a negative way, but it was because he was creating the invitation. But he was recognizing that actually he might hear things that he might not want to hear. Next one, Rick.
Philippa, you should really speak about this because this is kind of your home ground.
Yes, I do a lot of work with organizations around how they take decisions. But actually, you need to be clear at the start of any open process. And it's part of the invitation. We keep saying the word invitation. It's really important. Where will the decisions be taken? Is it that ultimately it will all come back to the executive team or the CEO, the MD, whomever? Or are there different elements that these decisions will be taken more centrally, but these ones are actually, as Jenny was describing, more up for a more crowdsourced way of taking them, and therefore it does come back to that point of, unsurprisingly, all these questions are interlinked, but about whose strategy process is this really, which comes back to the PowerPoint that Chris was talking about. And Chris, do you want to talk about the final question, the bonus question?
Yeah, and I think you do have to decide how participative you want to be, because participation can mean involving 50 more people than usual. It can involve 5, 10, 50,000 people more than usual. And if I was to pick up on Graham's point, there is another view of strategy that it must and always does inevitably include everybody, because strategy is continually generated and regenerated in conversations in organizations. But I think when you're creating a deliberate strategy process to form an intent and to pursue an implementation, you do have to say, what are our boundaries, particularly internal, external? And we have a bias towards looser, more involving, more participative, and as external as possible. But not all organizations want that, particularly where they're working with some areas that are commercial in confidence or secret. So you do have to get clear, what are our boundaries, who are we involving, how do we involve them? And if you get that right, our experiences, by get that right, I mean the answers to these questions, you ask them rigorously, you design a process that works, and it is universally better to be more participative. But you should only do it if you genuinely are willing to open up and be curious and do good exploring.
So I think
I just want to say, can we make a link to our October the 20th event? Because I think if any of you are interested in that, we have Olga Gazarian and William Garud from WaterAid, and they're going to be speaking not with Philippa and I. We'll be here as participants, but actually they're going to be speaking with John Higgins, who is GameShift's research partner. And some of you will know John Higgins from his work on Speak Up and employee activism, and also from his work with Mark Cole, problematizing the whole field of OD because of its links to power and power centricism. There's a link to the event just come up in the chat there. And I think if you're interested in the more frontiers of this, as to how do you move beyond traditional views of strategy in participative work, then you'll find John really interesting. And the case study with WaterAid should touch on some of that for us.
So unless somebody else has anything else to say, this is sort of the point when we say thank you for coming, and lovely to talk with you, and thank you for all those of you who've contributed and given input to make it really rich. Is there anything anybody else needs to say? Otherwise, we will go, which obviously means that Chris can then leave his travel lodge. Prison. Yeah. It does rather look like prison bars behind you. But we'd like to thank you for coming, and hope to see you on another one. As I say, Rick has put the link into the chat, and it'll be on LinkedIn and Twitter and all those kind of good places. Again, or else just send an email to Rick and he'll make sure you're on the list for next time.
Terrific. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Really good to see you all. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.